would now like to begin the 386th lecture meeting for the YIES, Yomiuri International Economic Society. We're quite honored to be able to welcome the Honourable Scott Morrison, the 30th Prime Minister of Australia, as the lecturer today. Please do welcome him with applause.
It's wonderful to be here in Tokyo with so many good friends. Can I thank the Forum for their kind invitation to be here with you today. Can I also thank my dear friend Kitamura-san for his involvement and his friendship here, which has brought me here once again to Tokyo. And can I acknowledge Alison Hooker, who's with me, who's a Senior Vice President at American Global Strategies, where I now serve as the Non-Executive Vice Chairman with Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who was, of course, the former National Security Advisor to President Trump. This is an important forum, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some important thoughts, I think, at this rather significant juncture for particularly allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region who believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific and the threats to that and how together we might address them. The era of post-Cold War economic globalisation that we have known for the past 30 years is over, and it is not coming back anytime soon. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the absence of a peer or near-peer competitor to the United States ushered in a period of unprecedented economic growth, accelerated by an economic policy orthodoxy of liberalised trade and investment and open access to science and technology. This is also no longer the case, and that requires us to adjust. We have entered a new era of globalised strategic rivalry. This is recasting the way the global economy works while threatening the foundational principles upon which our post-World War II global order is based. This includes the primacy of universal human rights, the rule of law. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and the disciplines of our global financial system embedded in platforms and institutions such as SWIFT payment systems, the IMF, the Financial Stability Board and the World Bank. The rivalry is being played out globally and across many theatres: geographic, political, ideological, military and economic, just like in a Cold War. So how did we get here? During the post-Cold War period, the US and its allies laboured under the assumption that the growing prosperity afforded by economic globalisation, particularly in authoritarian regimes such as China and post-communist regimes in Russia, would lead to increased liberalisation and even democracy. This proved to be false. In China's case, the PRC always saw such goals as a direct threat. In Foreign Affairs last year, Michael Beckley recounted that after President Clinton granted most favoured nation status to China, Jiang Zemin reportedly warned his foreign policy officials that this so-called engagement policy was just another way to try with ulterior motives to change the country's socialist system, to westernise and divide our country, he reportedly said, and put pressure on us in an attempt to overwhelm and put us down. Xi Jinping is no different. If anything, having personalised the PRC regime to himself more than any other leader since Mao, and restored the centrality of communist ideology, empowering the CCP over the Chinese state and its economy, he is even more brazen. During post-Cold War globalisation, rather than transforming into liberal democracies, regimes like China translated their newfound access to global trade and capital markets, as well as legitimacy in international forums, to build the economic, diplomatic, technological and military capacity to one day challenge the prevailing status quo. That day is now upon us. Unlike the Cold War rivalry between the Americans and the Soviets, this new era of strategic rivalry is not confined to binary competition between two apex powers. This rivalry is actually far broader. It's not just about the PRC. They have fellow travellers: Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, just to name a few. It is a rivalry between what I described when I was Prime Minister back in 2021 in Australia as a rivalry between an arc of autocracy seeking to render the prevailing rules-based order impotent to their authority and ambitions, and an alignment of nations, like-minded, who know that their freedom, sovereignty and prosperity depends on the maintenance of such global universal standards, rules and norms. The work of this autocratic arc has been most notably on display in Ukraine, where illegal Russian aggression has been supported by Chinese banks, trade and dual-use technology, as well as Iranian drones and North Korean missiles. Russia became China's 5th biggest single country trading partner last year. That's up from 9th in 2020, while Chinese exports to Russia rose by 46.9% in 2023 year on year. If we were in any doubt about the broader implications of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, Anne Applebaum cites Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in Autocracy Inc., remarking soon after the war began, saying, "This is not about Ukraine," he said, "at all, but the world order. The current crisis is a fateful, epoch-making moment in modern history. It reflects the battle over what the world order will look like." We see similar collaboration in the relationships the PRC has with developing countries, especially in Africa. This includes sharing access to security technology to control their populations, obligation-free and opaque financing arrangements that enable corruption, and diplomatic quid pro quos that provide reciprocal cover for their respective behaviours. Of particular concern is the opening up of alternative trade and financial channels that blunt the force of global financial sanctions and facilitate the movement of funds and weapons, such as to Iranian proxies in the Middle East and Hamas and Hezbollah, enabling them to engage in terrorism. A popular misconception is that the PRC wishes to rule the world and become the apex power within the international system. To the contrary, the PRC, or Russia for that matter, doesn't want to rule the world. They just don't want to be ruled by it. Their goal is not the rule of law, but as Anne Applebaum argues, to rule by their own law. Rather than rule the world, they just want to rule their part of it forever and unchallenged. That includes extending beyond their own borders to create buffer zones that achieve that same purpose. The purpose of autocracies is simple: protect and perpetuate their regimes, to hold on to and increase their power. The PRC and fellow autocracies have learned they do not need to tear down global institutions such as the United Nations or other international bodies to undermine global rules and norms. They just need to infiltrate, distract and dilute them so they can continue on their merry way. Global institutions with Chinese characteristics. To this end, they are having success. It's also important to appreciate that relationships between autocracies are transactional. They're not values-based. They do not necessarily need to buy into each other's specific causes because they share a far broader one: reduced US presence in each of their regions and theatres. A further geopolitical force rising in the world today is the large band of developing nations, now referred to as the Global South. These nations account for the majority of the world's population and are no longer taking their cue, or prepared to do so, and settle for what is handed out to them by apex powers, whether they be China or the United States, and the broader developed world. In our own Indo-Pacific region, this includes nations such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, who do not wish to be forced to choose between rival spheres. Yet at the same time, they do wish to retain the flexibility to choose either and engage with any nation they believe can advance their national interests. Unsurprisingly, though indeed benefiting from global rules and norms, they are more focused on their own economic development, security and welfare. So what's to be done? If we wish to avoid conflict and preserve the peace and stability afforded by our global rules and based order, the arc of autocracy must be deterred. An effective counterbalance must be present. There must be an intentional, comprehensive, credible, persistent and integrated policy of deterrence pursued by like-minded and capable nations to resist the aggressive and coercive behaviours of autocratic regimes. Such deterrence must work across the military, diplomatic and economic spheres. We also must appreciate that this period of rivalry may persist for decades, as it did during the Cold War. Cold Wars tend to end badly in one of two ways for the unsuccessful rival: by defeat in a hot war, or by their demise through the gradual decline from within, as their political, social and economic systems collapse under the prolonged weight of the contest. And neither of these outcomes is likely in the near term, possibly even in the medium. And only a credible military deterrent will prevent a hot conflict from becoming a reality anytime soon. In recent years, like-minded nations have been attempting to build such a credible deterrent. Japan has been a leader in this regard, inspired by the leadership and vision of the late Shinzo Abe, and ably supported by his successors. And it was my privilege as Prime Minister of Australia to partner and work directly with all of those leaders. While such efforts have been undertaken within established global institutions, it has importantly also been pursued through smaller multilateral forums such as the G7, the Quad Leaders Dialogue, and through the formation of new multilateral partnerships such as our AUKUS defence agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, which I was pleased to have founded as Prime Minister, as well as upgraded bilateral security ties, including here in Japan with the first ever Defence Forces Reciprocal Access Agreement concluded with Australia in 2022 after several years of discussion between myself and Prime Ministers Abe, Suga and Kishida. The restoration of the Quad Leaders Dialogue in 2021 is a shared legacy of those who were present at the time who I had the privilege to join. As Quad leaders came together for that first time, Quad nations were already active in security partnerships, were well advanced in restoring joint military cooperation, such as the Malabar naval exercises, amongst many other initiatives. Now, while recognising the primacy of defence and security cooperation as the Quad's strategic priority, its top priority, as Quad leaders we also knew the new dialogue had to go further. As a consequence, a key focus of our dialogue was to address cooperation in the economic sphere. Initially, this focused on supply chain integrity, critical minerals access and critical technology cooperation. We also stressed the need for outreach, economic outreach, to developing nations in the Indo-Pacific, to build their resilience, their prosperity, health and well-being. ASEAN were a key partner in this endeavour. At the time, the most pressing need in the non-military security sphere was providing access to COVID vaccines. Observing the forum today, I would caution Quad leaders to take care to ensure it does not allow its focus and agenda to become diluted and distracted. It must remain intentional by focusing on a short list of high priorities that fundamentally contribute to strengthening regional stability and security, including economic security. Ongoing policy workshops and coordination of ODA programs that populate Quad communiques these days are fine, but too often just represent diplomatic business as usual. Such initiatives, frankly, do not require leaders to meet together for these things to be done. This is not what the Quad Leaders Dialogue should be expected to be delivering. If anything, the mere fact that the Quad Leaders Dialogue provides the opportunity for regular, unscripted engagement and real-time collective assessment by leaders on regional security and economic challenges has a value all of itself. The most valuable comment to emerge from the recent meeting in Delaware was President Biden's candid hot mic admission about the PRC and Xi Jinping seeking to test rivals. This sends a clear signal about what's truly at stake. It also has the ability, through acknowledgement, to galvanise action. When the Quad Leaders Dialogue was reconstituted, it was attacked by the PRC, as they well knew the deterrent power of such regular, high-level collaboration between like-minded countries focused on Indo-Pacific security in all of its forms. Consequently, the Quad must not feel the need to overpopulate its agenda to fill out diplomatic communiques and validate its existence. It does not need announceables. It needs to exist and meet regularly to ensure that their collective actions and responses to foster a free and open Indo-Pacific are aligned and on point. And where they are not, to change course. In many ways, for the Quad, less would be more and would keep autocracies guessing. In approaching its economic task, the Quad must also better appreciate and leverage its greatest strength. Quad nations are all market-based economies. That is their true superpower. What sets us apart from the autocracies offering opaque grants and punitive debt is the deep capital pool we offer from our private sector, together with the commercial expertise, technology and technical knowledge of potential investors and business partners that can transform these developing economies that we seek to reach out to. Trade and investment liberalisation have played an important role in paving the way for this offering, as have overseas development finance and assistance programs. However, the main line of economic effort by Quad nations within the Indo-Pacific has been delivered by the private sector. To date, the Quad is yet to truly enlist, align and leverage the support of private, corporate and institutional capital at scale and with single-minded purpose to advance their economic security objectives. The lack of focus on this task is leaving the Quad's most potent tool in the shed, as we'd say in Australia. Much is often made of the economic outreach undertaken by the PRC's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, to underpin economic development in Southeast Asia. According to the Lowy Institute's 2024 Southeast Asia Aid Map report, they said China has projects worth some $70 billion, still under implementation, and is involved in 24 out of 34 infrastructure mega projects in Southeast Asia. Now, while obviously important and highly visible, these projects, the scale of these investments is actually relatively modest in comparison to the flow of private foreign direct investment from the United States and Japan, together with other allies and partners, into Southeast Asia. According to ASEAN stats, in the 5 years to the end of 2023, the most recent data available, the flow, and I stress flow, not stock, of Chinese FDI into ASEAN nations totaled just over $65 billion. Now that's a significant sum. How it's less than a third of the flow of more than $200 billion invested by the US over the same period. The flow of Japanese and European FDI was also greater than China at $97.5 billion and just over $90 billion, respectively, from each of those spheres. The Republic of Korea came in at $50.9 billion. When considering trade, China is by far ASEAN's single largest two-way trading partner. That is true. However, the majority of this trade is in the form of imports from China rather than exports to China. Now, this is becoming worse as China seeks to dump its subsidised overproduction, intentional overproduction, in the region. In the 12 months to the end of March 2024, China enjoyed a $132.8 billion trade surplus with ASEAN, compared with ASEAN's $149.1 billion trade surplus with the United States. In total, ASEAN exported just over $275 billion in goods to the US. That's only $10 billion less than ASEAN exports to China. ASEAN also has a trade surplus with Japan and the EU, where its exports reached $118.5 billion and $155.7 billion, respectively, over the same period. The lesson of all of those statistics is that private, corporate and institutional capital, especially from the United States and Japan, is heavily and dominantly invested over others in Southeast Asian economies. Now, that presents a significant opportunity for the Quad. I suggest there are three ways the Quad can ensure they better utilise the significant impact of private investment within the Indo-Pacific as part of their economic security agenda. The first of these is to make sure that their policies do no harm. In this new area of strategic rivalry, the US, together with allies and partners, risks excluding strategically important Indo-Pacific partners as they move to de-risk and realign supply chains, reverse trade imbalances, restore sovereign industrial capabilities, withdraw investment from rival jurisdictions, prevent sensitive tech leakage and IP transfer, and ensure energy and resource security in the global transition to a low emissions economy. All of these objectives are positive, by the way, but care must be taken in their implementation. The subsidies and incentives provided by the CHIPS Act and the IRA are good examples of these types of initiatives. The same is true for increased tariffs, especially those directed at China, that began during the Trump years and have been continued by the Biden administration. While appreciating the intent of these measures, especially regarding sensitive and critical sectors, it is important to be discerning in their application. Indiscriminate application carries the risk of significant unintended consequences for existing and potential allies and partners. This would be counterproductive to regional security objectives, especially in the Indo-Pacific, where US economic outreach is so vital to these relationships. For example, it is understandable that the US would wish to interrogate the true source of a particular supplier investment when China is clearly engaged in a deliberate strategy to outsource their production to intermediaries as a way to access US markets and bypass new restrictions. Fair enough. However, such interrogation must be careful not to falsely penalise genuine partners. There is legitimate concern amongst partners in Southeast Asia and even allies about these measures. Similarly, it is a positive initiative for the US to incentivise firms such as rare earths provider Lynas, an Australian provider, to establish processing operations in Texas. But it would be counterproductive to disincentivise Lynas to walk away from the significant capabilities they have built up in Malaysia. Let's not forget those same processing capabilities in Malaysia were established in partnership with Japan when the PRC unilaterally turned off Japan's access to China's rare earths some 15 years ago when they took exception to Japanese foreign policy. In the security sphere, allies and partners have proved to be the most successful way to build an effective military deterrent. The same will be true when it comes to economic security. The US will not rebuild its industrial base as quickly and as effectively as it needs to if it does not draw on the network of its allies and partners, including more neutral actors who can also add value. This will be as true for allies like Japan, Australia, Korea, the Philippines and Singapore as it is for India, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia and even Vietnam. Obviously, each engagement must be calibrated, but in all cases we must ensure that it is boosting the economic resilience of core partners and allies. And when we do this, we do not needlessly isolate others and create opportunities for our rivals. The second of these measures is to work within the investment community to better understand what governments can do to de-risk private investments in strategic sectors within emerging economies in the Indo-Pacific. This includes transport infrastructure, energy generation and transmission lines, resource processing and extraction, communication networks, which includes undersea cables and indeed satellites, as well as agriculture. Governments can be very effective using their balance sheets to achieve the security outcomes they seek if they just listen and partner with investors in the private sector. Now in Australia, when I was Prime Minister, we achieved this by ensuring that Digicel, which was the dominant telco in the Pacific Islands, was acquired by Telstra rather than falling into the hands of rival interests. Our government was hands-on and proactive in securing this result. However, our success was not by simply calling up Telstra and imposing on them. It was by ensuring the deal could be structured in such a way that it could be legitimately supported on commercial terms on its own and was seen as being in the best interest of shareholders. Institutional capital in the form of pension funds, large trading companies, multinational companies, private equity and sovereign wealth funds must all act in the interests of their members, investors and shareholders. If there is an impediment to these funds finding their way into the types of investments within the Indo-Pacific that would boost regional security, then we just have to find the answer. I appreciate this is not so straightforward. For many years, efforts have been made to align institutional capital with infrastructure projects in the region, for example, and without success, as such projects simply didn't always measure up to what are the legitimate standards and benchmarks for the investors. However, the response can't just be to shrug our shoulders when that's the case. Such a response will only confirm to developing countries that Quad countries can't make things happen and turn to rival capital sources, and that will only worsen their strategic dependence. So this is exactly where I think the Quad has to go to work. If the project is important enough, then the policy case can and must be made to structure a package that can make sure the investment gets over the line. Doing this across 4 jurisdictions and Quad jurisdictions would be incredibly powerful. Gaining access to more reliable data and benchmarks, price indices, securing a more favourable regulatory environment, loan guarantees, supplementing project management expertise, removing bureaucratic roadblocks, recalibrating ODA programs, or ensuring ODF loans become a part of the overall capital package. These are just some of the practical tools that can be employed. But it does require us to be proactive. Existing Quad efforts in this area, while well-intentioned, could not be described in these terms. The recent launch, though, of the Mineral Security Partnership Finance Network just at New York this week will hopefully prove to be more effective and is more of the style of what I'm suggesting. Either way, we still need to do far more than we're doing now. Now that brings me to the final and third point. We need a clear plan within the Quad that understands where our most urgent strategic vulnerabilities and opportunities are, and then the capability and intent of Quad nations to act in concert to address them. Now, a great example of this is Sri Lanka. Some years ago, the PRC gained a majority interest in the Hambantota port by snaring a corrupt Sri Lankan government into a debt trap. Sri Lanka entered into sovereign default and are now seeking to claw their way back from complete economic collapse. Last Saturday, Sri Lanka elected a new president and they will elect a new parliament later this year in November. The newly elected president is likely to have a more open and embracing position towards the PRC than his predecessor and has already signalled his intention to revisit the deals done with the IMF and other multilateral and bilateral debt partners. If Quad nations and Quad capital remains on the sideline as these issues are played out, then the Hambantota port episode will be replaced and repeated many times over, and India will have their own version of Cuba off their southern coast. The good news is that Quad nations are already active and present, but it's not clear they're working together on this. India's National Security Advisor made a rather public visit to Sri Lanka in the lead up to the recent elections, clearly demonstrating their awareness of the issues that are being faced there. Japanese investors are developing the new second terminal at the airport in Colombo. The US International Development Finance Corporation announced a $553 million investment to build a new deepwater shipping container terminal in Colombo. The principal shareholder in that project is the Indian conglomerate Adani. An even larger development project is mooted for the northern terminal, while Chinese investors are building a logistics hub in the centre of the port precinct with a rail link to the airport. These proposed expansion works will put the Port of Colombo comfortably in the top 20 and possibly even the top 10 ports in the world. Now, given what's at stake, I hope that developments in Sri Lanka were a topic of discussion amongst Quad leaders when behind closed doors in Delaware last weekend. If it was not, it should have been. If not, I'd be concerned that the Quad is failing to appreciate its important agency to influence exactly these types of situations positively as part of a broader strategic effort. At the very least, they should have been satisfying themselves that existing individual efforts are sufficient to address the very real risks that are present. A similar case can be made for a clear Quad investment strategy in relation to Cambodia. The West may bemoan PR access to the Ream naval base, or the PRC's significant financial support for the Sinukville port expansion. But where is the alternative? Quad members can either get involved and contest economically in these strategic locations, or surrender the ground to our rivals. When in office, in conclusion, I was often criticised for the strident position I adopted towards the PRC in my government. I believe this was necessary to counter the PRC's deliberate strategy to test Australia's will and to split us off from our allies and partners. I believed that pretending to share values and interests with an autocracy seeking to bully and coerce us while they were undermining the very rules and norms that afford us our freedom got us exactly where we were at that point and where we are today. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. This does not mean we do not engage diplomatically with China or even trade and seek cooperation on global challenges, be that climate change, human trafficking, organised crime, or many others. We can peacefully coexist, but only with the right safeguards in place. We must do so with our eyes wide open and with the good sense to put a sufficient deterrent in place to counterbalance the growing power and influence of autocracies. The objective of such a deterrent is actually quite simple and practical: to ensure that when President Xi wakes up every morning and thinks about Taiwan, he concludes, not today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison, for the very powerful speech. And we'd now like to have a talk session with Mr. Kitamura, YIES Chairman.
Thank you, Prime Minister Morrison. I appreciate very much your lecture to all the spectators. You provided a holistic picture of the surrounding situation concerning security and economy in our region. First of all, I like to pose maybe the theme of your speech. You mentioned about the end of the economic globalization. And maybe you signified that we are entering into the era of the de-risking. In case of the invasion of Russia against Ukraine, we can observe the dysfunction of the United Nations through the economic coercion of PRC. We can also observe the dysfunction of the WTO. In entering into the era of the de-risking, you gave birth to the Quad, maybe new type of the international cooperation. In this situation, what kind of international cooperation is effective and practical to our region?
Well, thank you very much, Kitamura-san. That's a much shorter summary of a speech was much longer than that. My apologies for the length. The reason groups like the Quad and G7, and I'd say G7 Plus, which at various times has invited other nations to participate. When I was there, on each occasion, Australia was invited, but certainly so was India, which was important, as was Korea. The frustration of dealing with large international bureaucracies and the way they are largely become quite impractical in the ability to deliver results on the ground out of obvious areas of operational roles such as aid delivery and humanitarian support and things of that nature, which they do a commendable job. But when it comes to managing global security, they just don't have the dexterity or the practicality or, frankly, the shared set of interests that are required to motivate action. And that's why I think groups like Quad and for that matter, AUKUS was born out of a similar idea that these groupings need to be able to move more swiftly, they need to be more integrated in terms of their own values base, and they need to have an operational role that was integrated. And it's very difficult to do that in large international institutions where they can be so regularly frustrated. So yes, I think in an age of strategic rivalry, we're going to see more action, I hope, undertaken in those types of forums. That's not to abandon the other ones. But a good example of that was when you look at the G20. I sat around the G20 table both as a Prime Minister, at the Leaders' Dialogue, as well as a Treasurer in the Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meetings. I found in the G20 meetings I attended, it was an impossible task because of the lack of any clear line of agreement across so many issues in the values base. You had autocracies sitting around that table together with democracies trying to deal with what are effectively political issues of which there was no common view. And then there was this rather tortured process of producing a communique that tried to pretend that that wasn't the case. It was a bit comical, frankly. That said, on the economic side, I actually found the finances meeting and the central bank governors meeting far more productive because that was trying to deal with issues of financial stability and certainty. So, you know, it's not to say those institutions can't still be useful, but the practical ones on real security, they're smaller, they're more agile, and they can't allow themselves to behave like the big global institutions, which is frankly my fear at the moment with where the Quad is currently sitting.
Thank you very much. Your insightful and candid comment about my question. It's my opinion that concerning the effective international cooperation, the role of the United States is so critical. I have a lot of friends in the United States, and you are knowing the actual candidate, President Trump, and the Vice President Kamala Harris. In observing the election campaign, the diversion of the policy between two candidates is rather considerable, especially on the domain of energy and the economy. What do you expect the new president of the United States in this area, or the security also?
I'd say, and I say this not as an American, and so my apologies if there are any Americans, which I know there are some in the audience, outsiders talking about someone else's country's politics, I think you have to be respectful, and so I will seek to do that. But it's my observation, both as a politician and knowing, having met both of the candidates, former President Trump and Vice President Harris, and dealt with both of them. For those of us who don't live in the United States, the most fierce element of the partisanship that you see on display in the United States is actually domestic. It's about domestic political issues. I'm sure the same is true here, where the context gets most animated. On the issues that impact outside the United States, on foreign policy, at a high macro level, you'd say that there is agreement, there is bipartisanship when it comes to the threats of autocracies and the need to have in place a credible, effective deterrent. I'd say there's bipartisanship about the need to restore the US industrial base and particularly expand the capability of its defence industrial space. There'll be some differences of views about how that's achieved at the margin, but I think the overall intent on either side is actually the same. And that has upsides and downsides because both sides walked away from the CPTPP. Both sides have embraced a protectionism, which in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, there's always been some concerns about that. And I think there continues to be concerns about that. But both sides feel the same way about protectionism. So we shouldn't pretend that one side is less drawn to that measure than others. And so that is a challenge that I think nations outside of the US will have to deal with either way, with whoever's elected. But when you come down to the individual candidates themselves, I mean, an obvious difference is we know what President Trump's views are. We have seen them. We have seen them implemented, and people can have whatever view they like about that. But the Abraham Accords, for example, the strong position that the Trump administration took, particularly in relation to China, and which was the forerunner, frankly, to the Quad and to AUKUS. Quad and AUKUS, I don't think, would have happened at all had it not been for what was occurring during the time of the Trump administration. And so I think there are, sure, outside of the United States and possibly, well, not possibly, definitely within, there are critics of style, approach and the unorthodoxy of President Trump's approach. But when you look at the results, the lifted investment by Europeans in NATO and in so many other areas, it's a pretty strong record. In relation to Vice President Harris, what's not as clear is the positions that she holds on all of those issues. Now, if it was simply a cut and paste of President Biden's position, well, we'd have a better idea. President Biden's commitment to allies and partners, I thought, was outstanding. The engagement that was undertaken through the Quad and the formation ultimately of AUKUS and so on, outstanding. The bringing together Korea and Japan, outstanding. The question we have is, to what extent does the positions of the Biden administration carry into a potential Harris administration? And I don't say that as a criticism, but as an observation, simply to go, I hope we all find out before early November.
Thank you very much. Your accurate observation over the US politics. And as I mentioned, the internal politics give the considerable impact over the diplomacy and the international politics, I think. As you know, tomorrow, the election of the president of the LDP will take place. It will decide, actually, the future prime minister. I don't know if you know the 9 candidates of the LDP, but what do you expect the new prime minister of Japan, especially on the domain of the security?
Well, I went through this process twice when I was Prime Minister, with Prime Minister Suga and with Prime Minister Kishida, and on both occasions, frankly, it was an incredibly smooth process. There was a continuation of policy and relationship, and the relationship between Australia and Japan is at such a high level, just as it is with the United States, that supersedes, I think, all other elements, including changes in personnel. And so I would be very surprised if we were to see, as a result of tomorrow's election, any great change in the direction. Potentially changes in nuance or at the edges, as others here I'm sure would agree, but the fundamental path and position of the FOIP. I mean, Shinzo's legacy is massive in terms of the Indo-Pacific and what has flowed from that, and his successors, I think, if they continue to honour that legacy, will only continue to strengthen all of those relationships. And I would argue that Japan, particularly in the Quad, has a very important responsibility, as does Australia. I always refer to Japan and Australia as the spine of the Quad. And at least one of those leaders has to be taking a very active position within the Quad, I think, to achieve the sort of focus that it needs that I spoke about in my remarks. And I believe the new Japanese Prime Minister, and will be looking to the new Japanese Prime Minister, I think, to provide a lot of leadership in that regard. Japan has the real ability, I think, to direct and be a bit of a custodian of the integrity and path of the Quad. And I wish the new Prime Minister well, but I'd be quite certain that whoever it is, they will find great friends in Australia, in the United States, and in so many other places where this golden period, I would say, in many respects, of Japan's outreach and leadership globally in the Indo-Pacific, I hope and pray continues.
Thank you very much for your comment. I believe the FOIP support the scheme of the Quad. And after the Prime Minister Abe, the Prime Minister Suga, and the Prime Minister Kishida follow the general direction of the security and the diplomacy. I hope this direction will continue and followed by the new government also. I talked about a little bit different in the regional issues with Australia. Pacific Islands countries are so important from the viewpoint of the Pacific Islands country are so important. Of course, the Japanese government is engaged in supporting these countries. You talked about the importance of the Quad. What do you think about the outreach of the Quad towards these countries? Do you have some ideas or not?
Well, in the same way I spoke about the Quad having a clear plan when it comes to Cambodia or Sri Lanka, both of which sit within the Indo-Pacific. Equally, we have seen, I think, more of that type of approach in the Pacific Islands, led by Australia, but very much significantly supported in Japan and increasingly by the United States. That's a positive thing. And I think it's been successful. I think PRC infiltration and influence within the Pacific Islands has been wildly overstated. There is a superficial element to that, which comes in the form of infrastructure and other things that are built, but in terms of the depth of the relationship that particularly Australia, together with our Kiwi cousins across the ditch in New Zealand, between Australia and New Zealand, the depth of what I'd call our family relationships with the South Pacific are very strong and very resistant. From time to time, you will get leaders in the South Pacific who will become vulnerable, let me put it that way, diplomatically. And that is par for the course, and you just have to manage that as best as you can. And I think, to be fair, there's been a continuity between my government and the Albanese government in how we approached the Pacific. We started a thing called the Pacific Step Up. New Zealand at the time, under Prime Minister Ardern, had a very similar type approach. And that has been carried on. And often the greatest compliment to a policy that you may have had in government is that the one that follows you completely adopts it and gives it another name because they would like it to sound like theirs.
Thank you. And it's remarkable you use the phrase of the arc of autocracy, composed of the PRC, DPRK, Iran, and Russia. Of course, as you mentioned, it's so important for us to enhance the deterrent power against our adversaries, renounce the audacious action toward our neighbors. Concerning the arc of the autocracy, do you have some idea to cut the ties among these countries?
I think the first thing to do is to call it out. The greatest trick that is often played is by your adversaries is to pretend they don't exist and that there is no such adversarial or rival competing view. And I think what began under the Trump administration has continued, and Australia has played an active part of that, sometimes at our great cost, has been in calling this out. I think once you name it and you see it, then you can address it and you can see its influence and you can seek to counter that influence. I mean, no one is saying that, no one's suggesting there should be a regime change here or there or some sort of adventurous foreign policy that seeks to change the nature of those areas. That's not our business. That is the business of those who live there. But equally, I mean, one of the things that concerns me about this push by the arc of autocracy is not just that they're all autocrats, it's that they're actually working together. And when I was Prime Minister and the invasion of Ukraine commenced, one of the things that immediately concerned me was the wheat purchases by China out of Russia. And it seemed just unconscionable, while mouthing some sort of neutral position in relation to Ukraine, they were actively involved in enabling Russia to do exactly what it was doing, and have continued to, with impunity. And we've seen that from Iran, and we've seen that from North Korea. So I think being aware of this and calling it out, now that means we need to make sure that our sanctions regimes and things of that nature become more robust, because these autocracies now are working around them quite comfortably. And that will diminish the role of sanctions and things like that to be able to protect against what is autocratic coercive behaviour. The WTO has to get its act together in being able to more readily and deal with trade disputes. Otherwise, they just go there to waste away. And we saw this in Australia, that the new government in Australia decided to not pursue the WTO actions that we commenced against for what were illegal trade sanctions against Australia. They cut a different deal. The only downside of that is I have absolutely no doubt, had the WTO, finalised its process, they would have called those illegal trade and coercive sanctions out, and that outcome was avoided. So I do think we have to play out the contest. I do think we have to call out the contest and not pretend that these things don't exist, because they do.
Thank you. And I go back to the issue of the Quad. You underscored the orchestrating démarche against Belt and Road Initiative by Quad, inciting the example of Sri Lanka and Cambodia. In order to achieve the orchestrating démarche inside the Quad, we must find out some initiative. What can we ferment or create such kind of initiative for the aligned démarche toward specific issue?
This is often challenging, particularly, I don't want to use the phrase diplomatic community. By the way, I recognise all the members of the diplomatic community here today. The purpose of the informality of a grouping like the Quad is there are high-level engagements that occur between leaders and foreign ministers and others. So if leaders were to form a view that there is a vulnerability in Sri Lanka, which I would suggest there is, that's not a criticism of Sri Lanka. That's just an acknowledgement of their situation. They are having to climb their way out of complete economic catastrophe. So who's going to be their champions on that road? It should be the Quad nations. And India probably should take the lead on that, given they are most present in that. But they should be ably and enthusiastically supported by the United States, Australia and Japan and others. And so when projects are coming up, I mean, one of the challenges Sri Lanka has, and the IMF sets this out in their own report on Sri Lanka, is they have an SOE sector in Sri Lanka which is somewhat past its prime. And those SOEs are in critical parts of the Sri Lankan economy. It's in their ports, in their airports, in their aviation and their energy and all of these things, which if they don't improve their performance, then the Sri Lankan economy can't improve its performance. And so the need for private capital investment into a lot of these, I think, will be very necessary. And that's where there needs to be good communication, good alignment, and dialogue between all the Quad partners, and bringing in important sort of institutional capital here, whether it's the trading companies or others, or even ADB and so on. And then you can set about ensuring you're having a coordinated approach to the asks and the requests and the opportunities that are going to come up in a place like Sri Lanka. So it isn't, forming a new group or, frankly, even a working party. It's just people getting on the phone, practical people working within each of the administrations, calling in the right people out of the private sector. I mean, for example, that loan that the US Development Finance Organisation has put into the port, what that says to every other potential private investor is that the US has a foot on the ground here, a stake in that project, and that's a very encouraging signal for other private investors to go on and put the same capital in. So, government's loans, concessional loans and grants and so on do not have to be particularly large at all. It is actually the endorsement that comes from, if you saw Japan, Australia, the United States and India turn up in various forms, in various investment projects and things that were happening in a place like Sri Lanka or Cambodia or anywhere else for that matter, if you're sitting around an institutional capital table or something like that, well, that's going to get your attention and you're going to feel a lot more comfortable than setting off to try and invest in something like that all on your own. And so I think that's where what we learned in Australia, particularly over the Digicel position, was that governments have more power to influence these outcomes beyond just writing a cheque. It's where you write it, who you do it in partnership with. It's often the diplomatic engagement that may even occur with that administration themselves. I mean, in some of these countries that you want to see this investment, the capability around how do you run a proper listing process or a privatisation process, or do you have all the right skills of people that you would need to have on that project, which when the institutional capital investor looks at it goes, oh, I can have confidence to do that. Governments can solve a lot of those problems. And then all of a sudden these investments become very real. What I'm seeing at the moment, it's a bit one out. And it's not, they might do this for that reason, they might do this for this reason. But actually, if they started talking to each other, I think that the overall result will be far more powerful. Remember, 200 billion plus out of the US in 5 years, compared to less than 70 out of China. And that was without them, that was just what they're doing.
Maybe it will be the last question. In observing the warfare in Ukraine, the cyber warfare started far beforehand the conventional warfare. In reading the joint statement of the Quad, the cybersecurity and the cooperation with research and development is two pillars for the cooperation. Do you have some concrete future image of the cooperation on the domain of the cybersecurity? Actually, Japanese government is preparing for the new measures for the active cyber defense.
I think on these more obvious areas of security, the capabilities, be they in the hard military format or in the, as you say, the cyber domain, I'm far less concerned about the level of cooperation and application that is occurring there. In fact, it's all happening. AUKUS is a good example of that, but there is so much going on bilaterally already. I think there's an appreciation of the importance of those tasks, and so I don't offer any criticism of that. I simply offer encouragement of it. I think the Quad always recognised that that security dimension of its activities were the highest priorities, and whether that happens specifically through the Quad or is happening otherwise through other channels, bilaterally, trilaterally, I think the Quad being fully aware and having visibility over that and being comfortable with the direction that is fine. I think on the sort of economic side, though, that's far less developed. Far less developed. And, that's what the region thinks too. And in Southeast Asia in particular, I think they can see and understand the value of the security partnerships to provide stability in the Indo-Pacific, but then continue to remain frustrated on the economic security side, which is frankly troubling them more on a day-to-day basis. And that's where I think they're really looking to the Quad to answer that and give them greater confidence about how that's going to work. But as I said in my remarks, the first thing the Quad can do, like this was always my golden rule in government, step one, don't make it worse. Don't do any harm. Then you can move on to the other things. I think, as having just been in Singapore with very senior leaders, including the Prime Minister there in the last few days, there's no doubt in my mind about their desire to be pragmatic and support a stable the FOIP, doing reasonably well on the military security side things. On the economic, I think we've got a lot more to do.
Thank you very much.
And now, anyone in the floor would like to ask questions? Well, our time remaining is not very long, but we would like to entertain questions from the floor. And if you have a question, please raise your hand.
No questions? Well, we have heard that Mr. Morrison is very busy, so although we have a few minutes left, we'd like to conclude the lecture meeting. And thank you so very much to Prime Minister Morrison and Chairman Kitamura. Thank you. Both gentlemen will be leaving us now, so please do remain seated and wait for them to exit the room. Could we have another round of hearty applause for our two lecturers?